One of the challenges of talking about the challenges of boys and men is that there are so many ways in which boys and men are still top of the ladder. There's still a gender pay gap in favor of men. Most CEOs, by huge margin, are still male. And if you look at the money going through venture capital to female founders, it's about 2 or 3% of the money. There's a huge wealth gap in favor of men. And so there are all these inequalities that are still running very much in favor of men on average, and especially at the top. But that doesn't mean that all men are doing well. And in fact, working class men and black boys and men on many measures, economically, educationally, are really struggling, really falling behind on many measures. So it's very important that we don't assume that what's happening to men at the top of society is reflective of what's happening to all men. And we also have to give ourselves permission to be advocating for policies to increase the share of women, for example, in politics and in business and in technology companies, and at the same time worrying about what's happening to many men in the education system and in terms of their mental health and so on too. So in the spirit of thinking two thoughts at once, it's perfectly possible to say there's more work to do, particularly on those economic issues for many women and girls, and to say that there are these issues facing boys and men. And not for nothing, if we don't take seriously the fact that there are now some gender gaps where it really is boys and men who are the ones we should be focusing more attention on, including in education, suicide rates, etc., at the same time as realizing that there are gender gaps running the other way. If we don't do that, then it creates a dangerous vacuum in our politics and in our culture, to the extent that these problems are real, they're not confected, and someone's searching for answers to those problems or feeling maybe alone as they struggle with those problems, they'll go and find somebody who is talking about those problems, who does make them feel seen and heard. And we may not like where they end up, especially if it's online. There's a real danger that male problems, neglected, become grievances. And those grievances can be weaponized in ways that are just bad for all of us. I'm the father of 3 boys, all now in their 20s, so I guess I have to learn to say men, because they're definitely not boys anymore, they're all adults. So I've raised 3 boys through adolescence in the era of the internet, and many parents really troubled, I think, by what's happening online and where some of our boys and young men can end up. There are some pretty dark corners of the internet, and there are some pretty influential figures online who are getting into the minds of many of our boys and our men, and I think in some cases poisoning those minds. But they start by saying some things that are true and plausible, which is, hey, there are some real challenges with being a boy and a man today in society. There are real questions about what does it mean to be a man. And we're in a very dangerous spot if a young man or a boy is effectively Googling the question, how should I be a man today, or whatever the equivalent of Googling will be by the time you hear this, and getting answers that can be like, well, how men used to be, or because men are better than women, or by dominating women, or by being more than, rather than saying we are absolutely with women as equals in our society now, while still being men. And that's the conundrum, that's the real challenge that we're facing now. But simply rolling our eyes or pathologizing the boys and men who are earnestly searching for answers because the places they find them are ones that we're concerned about is not the answer. We need to have we all need to be having a better conversation if we don't want the conversation to be dominated by reactionary and poisonous figures. That's on us, and it's part of our mission. Over the last few decades, we've torn up, in many ways, the old scripts for what it meant to be male and female, man, woman, masculine, feminine, and we've replaced the old script for women, which was simplifying horribly to raise kids, stay home, housewife, mother, etc. And we've pretty effectively torn that up for most women, especially in advanced economies, and replaced it with a much more positive message of empowerment and autonomy and upward mobility. As Gloria Steinem famously said, the point of the women's movement is to make marriage a choice rather than a necessity. I would say just being with a man, a choice rather than a necessity. And that language of empowerment and liberation has been honestly a blessing to have witnessed during my lifetime, and certainly compared to my parents, who had a loving and very equal marriage in many ways, nonetheless a very clear script. So we've torn up the old female script and replaced it with a new script. And at the same time, we have torn up the old male script, which was you're going to be a provider, you're going to be a breadwinner, you're going to be, to use the incredibly old-fashioned term now, head of the household. And instead, you're going to be an equal partner, and your partner or wife is going to earn. And you're going to have to retask what it means to be a provider. You're still going to be a provider in various ways, but in a much more equal and different way, perhaps. So we've torn up the old script. And what have we replaced it with? And I think the answer is we're only just beginning that process. And so many boys and men feel like they're improvising. They're in the middle of the stage of life. They don't have a script anymore telling them very clearly, you should do this is how to be a man. And they're getting conflicting and confusing messages from all sides, and many of them are lost, and many of them are searching for answers. And improvisation is really hard, and it's particularly hard if you don't have resources and power. But that's the moment we're in right now. And we don't want to make the mistake of just rewriting another fixed script of how to be a man. And we certainly don't want to say, oh, the old script was the right one. But it is at least a clear one. And too many men are being attracted to this idea that the old script for masculinity and manhood is the right one. Instead of saying, how do we re-script masculinity for the modern world? Without in any way saying we have to cease being men, but we have to be men that are equals with women and in a different way. So I'm sometimes asked, what is the new script for masculinity and manhood? I'm like, well, I hope there isn't one. I hope there are many. And secondly, I honestly have no idea. But thirdly, I think it's the right question. Because what I hear behind that question is a much deeper one, which is, can we talk about what it means to flourish as a man today? That's the question that lies at the heart of all of our work. One of the biggest changes we've seen in recent years and decades has been the technology shock, and the fact that we're now raising our sons and our daughters effectively online on the internet with smartphones. And there's been a lot of attention paid, quite rightly, to the impact of social media, for example, on the mental health of teen girls and young women. But the technology shock is affecting boys and men too, and in some ways a bit differently. You see that boys and young men are much likely to be video gaming, for example. Online pornography is overwhelmingly consumed by boys and young men. And the evidence for the direct harms from those is actually not very good. It's pretty mixed. It's a difficult research area. But to me, that misses the point. I see the real challenge with what's happening to boys and men in this technological revolution is what they're not doing when they're online. It's the displacement of other activities that I think is the real problem. And because these games and other activities online are so immersive, and it can sometimes even be borderline addictive or actually addictive, is that what are you not doing? And there's no substitute for physical interaction, for relationships that are founded in the real world as well as online. And so in some ways, the technology revolution is impacting boys and young men almost in an opposite way to girls and young women, because what we see with girls and young women is how images, for example, are really stoking like body image problems and self-harm, but also the relationships. There's the relational bullying that, you know, on the average is somewhat more more common among girls and young women. So it's actually the mere fact of bringing people into relationship with each other and sort of seeing each other online is almost like it is a direct harm. Whereas I think with boys and young men, it's just much more indirect. It's actually sometimes the opposite of relational. It's isolating. And so the result actually is for many boys and young men to be more alone as a result of the technological revolution. And so we just shouldn't say that one is worse or better than the other. I think that's the kind of zero-sum framing that I'm certainly hugely opposed to. But we do need to recognize that the impact of technology is playing out somewhat differently in terms of mental health for boys and young men compared to women and young girls. As a parent, I only have sons, but if I had daughters, I'd be much more concerned about what they were consuming online, because I do think that the direct harm is real. Whereas with boys and young men, I'm more concerned about just how much time they're online and doing other stuff as well, that is just displacing other activities. I sometimes make the mistake of saying I have 3 boys, and when they're now all in their mid to late 20s, I have to stop saying that. They're all young men now, but it does raise an interesting question. Like, when does a boy become a man? Is there a year, magic year, 18? Is there a credential, a high school diploma, a college degree? Is there a mortgage deed? Is there a moving out away from home? Is there some hormonal change? Is it puberty? Is it... And there's no obvious answer to that, and that's great that there is no obvious answer. But it is important for us to think about what are the rites of passage, what are the gateways that we go through in order to go from being a boy and a man. So there's no magic date, there's no single rite of passage, but there are rites of passage. There are institutional changes. There are ways in which we move up and on and become mature. What's the difference between a boy and a man, in my mind, is not something that can be measured chronologically or biologically, hormonally or educationally or economically. I think it's measured in terms of maturity. That's really what it's about. It's about having kind of learned how to manage yourself, manage your own power, manage your own weaknesses, and how to be a generator, how to generate surpluses of love and other goods in the world. And so there's no magic moment. There's no specific right, but it is true that boys don't become men automatically. There's no automatic switch. There's no day on which you wake up as a man. There are instead a number of passages, a number of rights, a number of moments, a number of relationships, a number of changes that help us to make that transition. It doesn't happen by itself, and every society has learned one way or the other to help boys become men in one way or another. We shouldn't make the mistake of feeling like that's a task our society can neglect. Even though what it means to be a man is changing, helping boys to make that transition remains, I would argue, not only as important as in the past, but arguably even more important than in the past, given that the very nature of masculinity and manhood are changing. We've just got to help more of our boys and young men to make that transition. A world of immature men and adolescent men. Adolescence is great. It's a hot mess, but it's great. But you really don't want adolescent men. Adolescent boys are one thing. You don't want adolescent men. We all have to grow up. But rather than saying, oh, just grow up, what we should be saying is, how can we help each other to grow up?